If you've ever taken a sip of bourbon and felt that burn as it slides down your throat, that's called the warm Kentucky hug. Did you know that bourbon is the only American spirit native to the USA? Many people ask, why Kentucky? And that is because the answer is right beneath your feet. Kentucky is perfect for distilling bourbon because we have the right soil and seasons for growing corn. And 50% of the surface stone in Kentucky is limestone, and that is one of the most important factors for bourbon, distilling bourbon, is the limestone water. So if you distill bourbon with a water that is high in iron, it will turn your bourbon black. If you distill, or you need to distill with limestone filtered water because it is higher in pH than water filtered not through limestone, and that is important for fermentation. Also, distilling or filtering your water through limestone adds important minerals like magnesium, which is important for distilling bourbon as well. So there are 5 important things that make a bourbon a Kentucky bourbon, because bourbon can be distilled around the world, but a Kentucky bourbon has 5 specific things. It has to be at least 51% corn. Other grains include rye, wheat, and malted barley. It has to be stored in a charred oak barrel. It has to be distilled at no higher than 160 proof. It has to be barreled at no higher than 125 proof. And it has to be bottled at no less than 80 proof to be considered a Kentucky bourbon. As someone working in the bourbon industry, in the tourism industry in Kentucky, it's important for me and for you to understand the importance that bourbon has had in Kentucky and its future in Kentucky. So, we'll talk really quickly about how you distill bourbon, the distillation process. First, you take your mash bill, and that's the recipe for distilling bourbon. That's the amount of the different grains you have in your bourbon, how many times you distill it, and how long it's aged in the barrel. That is your recipe. So you start with the mash, which is a combination of your grains, your water, and your sugar. You then boil that mash and let it ferment. You take that fermented mash and put it in a still, a copper still. You heat that mash again, and those vapors is where you get your alcohol. That's where your spirit lives. The vapors of alcohol are lighter than the vapors of water. So the alcohol vapors go to the top of the still and are condensed on the way down into that white liquid, which is then stored in the charred oak barrels. A straight Kentucky bourbon has to be stored for no less than 2 years. To be usually though it's 4 years. So once those barrels have been aged and they've been stored for a minimum of 2 years, but usually 4 years, they take usually, if you're going to do just a regular bottle of bourbon, that is probably a blended bourbon. They take several hundred barrels at a time and put them into one big thing, and that's where you get the standard. Evan Williams is a good one. That's a standard flavor bourbon. That is several hundred barrels for one flavor. You also have single barrels, which is single barrels, which is where you take one barrel. It's not blended. That is a unique flavor. You also have very small batch barrels, which is where there's 2 to 10, sometimes 80, up to 80 barrels in a small batch. But after you've got your bottles and your bourbon, let's put it in the glass. So there's a couple ways to taste your bourbon first. Bourbon is usually tasted out of a tulip-shaped glass called a Glencairn. This allows the alcohol vapors to stay down here and the aroma to come up so you can taste those flavors. One way, the only way really to taste a Kentucky straight or a Kentucky bourbon is called the Kentucky Chew. You take a sip of bourbon and you put it in your mouth and you swirl it around, keep it in there for 3 seconds, and then you can swallow it. But you let the bourbon coat your palate. Experts say that you don't really get to taste your bourbon entirely until the 3rd swallow. So I encourage you, whether it's straight or on the rocks, to experiment and take that warm Kentucky hug.